Journalism is on the line right now, folks. What we get from the mainstream media is what I call propaganda. Obviously, they have an agenda, and they propagandize whatever it is that they want to propagandize to suit their agenda, hence the word propaganda. If there's somebody that comes on that they're going to invite on for a television interview that they disagree with, they will talk over the person, they will berate the person, they'll ridicule the person, and they won't address the issues. A case in point. Several months ago, some of you may be, Kevin Barrett was on television. We saw how Bill O'Reilly, or Shill O'Reilly, handled that. Okay? And around the same time, they had Professor Jim Fetzer come on. Now, I TiVo'd this particular interview, and I did a little bit of a time analysis. I don't have to talk about what the content was. Okay, we have Bill O'Reilly basically standing up for the official story, and Jim Fetzer, of course, discussing the controlled demolitions that so many of us agree with. And in the 6-minute and 20-second interview, I timed this thing out. For 6 minutes and 20 seconds, from the commercial break to the commercial break, Bill O'Reilly talked over Jim Fetzer for 5 minutes and 1 second. Now, is this journalism or is it propaganda? Yesterday I showed you a portion of the Glenn Beck program that they had me on, and you saw how they couched it before I even came on. They were talking about conspiracy theories, and someday you'll wake up with a Elvis comeback album in your stocking, you know? And I mean, this is the way they handle it. And when you really confront them with the facts and you stand their ground, they can't argue the facts, so they reduce themselves to basically ridicule. Talks about Osama bin Laden with two noses, and then he asked me, well, where are all those planes? I understand that it's in Area 51, you know? I mean, this is how they work this. And there are very few outlets that we have these days that are providing us with the alternative view of the world. Very few. There's a couple of national magazines, there are a couple of national networks that provide alternative talk shows, and there's only a couple of national newspapers, one of which has been the Standard, well, with a new name. What's it been, 4 years now since they called it American Free Press? It used to be the Spotlight. Okay. Spotlight's been around for, since the mid-'80s, I think. They came out 86 or something like that, thereabouts. But anyway, the point here is that we have very few journalists that have the, shall we say, testicular fortitude to tell the truth. Because as they say, no good deed goes unpunished. But I think we also realize what our founding fathers meant when they said they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Okay? The bottom line here, folks, is that, there are people out there, there are journalists that understand what honor is. And Mark is one of them. From the American Free Press, Mark Lang.
Oh, okay. This is one of those situations where the introduction almost outshines the speech. How do you even follow an introduction like that? Now, I brought my teleprompter, just like the TV people. Okay, so I do kind of a lot of reading. Writers read and readers write, you know. And I got some materials to show. And is the volume okay? La, 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 la. Okay. Well, it's great to be here. I've never been to Southern California. The OC, I told myself. Wasn't there a show called the OC? Cool, you know. Cool, dude. Anyway, yeah, as was stated, I'm Mark Anderson. At least that's what my driver's license tells me, so that's the name I stick with. I'm a reporter with American Free Press. I like to consider it the nation's foremost weekly paper where truth is no stranger, and telling it like it is a job requirement. It's refreshing. I've been at this newscraft for various newspapers for about 25 years, covering your school board meetings, your city councils, and things like that. And I've learned that to have a shot at the truth, you have to get past what I call the clutter. And there's an enormous amount of it out there. Today we're clobbered by that clutter, aren't we? Otherwise known as the dumbfounding array of information shoveled in our general direction by the modern big media, by the megaton. But let's define our terms. When we think of the media, we usually think of our newspapers, radio stations, and TV stations in the act of delivering news, or the news media. However, the broad term media does also mean the entertainment media, your movies, your TV programs. But a prime example are those glitzy infotainment magazines that litter our supermarket checkout lines, where we're treated to the perpetual personas of fashion models, constant how-to sex tips, and other sordid specimens of shallow, worthless pablum. Still, for momentary amusement in these checkout lanes, you can read Weekly World News, which is my favorite. I don't know about you. And there I learned that Bigfoot was Hillary Clinton's running mate. Perhaps only I saw that one coming. It's my insight, And you can also read in Weekly World that aliens stopped by the Earth just for Chinese takeout, for no other reason. I thought, cool. And then there's that tiresome Angela, Jennifer, Brad love triangle. I'm still fascinated by it, in which, for all we know, Brad Pitt will end up pregnant. But don't think this escapist crapola is limited to the tabloids and glossy entertainment rags. Oh, no. Our respectable daily newspapers, many of which run ads for X-rated theaters and phone sex lines. Chicago Sun-Times does that a lot. These respectable papers have crafted this process of diverting and dumbing down the reader to a higher and, dare I say, more sinister art form. At least we expect the Weekly World to report that a giant ant from Venus attacked a preschool. We expect it. And oh yes, we all want the Weekly World stories to be true to enliven our rather dull world, don't we? After all, if there really is a Godzilla, that would be kind of cool. And hey, American Free Press should have been all over the Hillary Bigfoot team running for president anyway. We missed a big story, and I'm still smarting from that one. So maybe we'll get our act together. Anyway, but let's step back and ponder some slightly more serious points. Millions of trees bite the dust constantly to be made into paper for the tabloids and for the more respectable mainstream print media. Also, we can read reams of sports and stock statistics, but we find next to nothing about how the local congressman voted on legislation. Many people can name their NASCAR guy, but they don't even know who their congressman is. Next, megatons of ink are splashed on these pages. Also, we can read about the two political parties and their boring manufactured candidates. But we find barely nothing, or we barely find anything in these papers about the Constitution Party, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, or any of the other parties. There's an ultra-important point here. By limiting nearly all news coverage to the two dominant parties that actually operate in unison, voter fraud happens long before we go to the polls on election day, as the newspapers program people to narrow their votes to the pre-approved candidates. That is, the media selects who we elect. There's an election, then there's an election. They narrow the field, then we vote on who's left. Then, in this journey from trees to the printing presses to the readers, our newspapers are distributed by the metric ton hither and yon. Also, we can read that global warming caused by humans is unquestionably true, while other opinions are gagged and thrown in the dungeon. Sounds like the 911 issue. The newspapers report on it as long as they toe the basic government line that some wild-eyed men and a couple of jetliners were the whole enchilada, and that only the fire from the two planes reduced the enormous Twin Towers completely to dust in a New York minute. Divergent opinions on 911 need not apply. The newspapers are basically saying, we've got our accepted 911 story and we're sticking to it. But actually, they're sticking it to us, aren't they? Indeed, mainstream papers are written in a manner that seems broad, but actually is gauged very narrowly. If you look close, you see this. They're confined within the ultra-tight frame of reference, within an ultra-tight frame of reference. Some call it the bubble, some call it the cage in this event this weekend. And this keeps us thinking inside the box without even knowing we're in a box. This is the average American, at least. Also, we can be emotionally prodded into action or into inaction, or even put into a state of semi-panic, so we'll give up our rights a little more easily on the basis of incomplete stories, falsehoods masquerading as truth, or outright propaganda. Now, I got a few little specimens to show here. Exhibit A and that kind of thing. How many people remember this headline here where the earth was in a skillet in USA Today? It's fairly recent. And notice here the image. This is the January 31, 07 edition of USA Today. We see the earth in a skillet stoking away on a gas stove to dramatize the news story, which says that not only is the earth warming like soup on a stove, but illustrious world scientists are assigning blame only to mankind's reliance on fossil fuels. The story probably made the Weather Channel's Heidi Cullen quite happy, so she can ramble on with her program, The Climate Code. I'm sure a lot of you have seen it, in which she engulfs the viewer in kind of a quasi-scientific vignette about the need to change our ways lest our cities flood and our crops dry on the vine. But the problem here is that this USA Today story didn't even so much as touch on other viewpoints, such as those of researcher S. Fred Singer and others who have good reasons not to buy the global warming is all our fault party line. Professor Singer is Professor Emeritus of Environmental Sciences at the University of Virginia and the founder and president of the Science and Environmental Policy Project, in Fairfax, Virginia, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research group of independent scientists that USA Today and other mass newspapers are very reluctant to discuss. So, representing American Free Press, I'll summarize the rest of the story on global warming that the big media generally withholds. Singer's scientific group, which works without salaries and insists they do not solicit support from either government or industry, should at least earn a mention from USA Today and other newspapers and journals, since readers, and especially policymakers, need to take all sides into account before making profound changes to our industrial policy, the kinds of fuels we use, which affects every man, woman, and child in the nation. And what did I do with my water? Excuse me a moment. No, I got plenty. Singer's group, for the record, holds a skeptical view of the current mainstream climate science because, as Singer told a Senate panel about 7 years ago, and I quote him, "We see no evidence to back its findings, that is, the conventional wisdom. Climate model exercises done on computers are not evidence." Vice President Al Gore keeps referring to scientific skeptics as, quote, "a tiny minority outside the mainstream." Singer goes on to say, "This position is hard to maintain when more than 17,000 scientists have signed the Oregon petition against the Kyoto Protocol because they see no compelling evidence that humans are causing discernible climate change." So while USA Today noted that various scientists all agree that global warming is man-made, but simply differ on which human activities cause it, here's a group of 17,000, that's a big number, 17,000 scientists who say that people don't have all that much to do with climate trends. Now, even if Singer's group is perceived as wrong, they at least deserve an honorable mention in the media, do they not? 17,000 scientists? I mean, come on, let's hear them out. Singer's observations, including his point that sunspots have something to do with the Earth's temperature, just aren't as dramatic as cooking the Earth in a skillet and sounding alarms about the decadent lifestyles of we Westerners casting humanity into the global blast furnace. I'm glad to say that American Free Press seeks a saner perspective, at least we try. Another exhibit here. Let me find my way through here. Here we go. We don't firmly conclude that the Earth is warming, nor do we really conclude that if it is warming, people are necessarily the primary cause of it. Instead, AFP, short for American Free Press, looks for perspectives and solutions that think outside the box. My assistant Angie and I attended this 2007 National Biodiesel Expo in Texas, where combating possible global warming was just one stated advantage of biodiesel fuel. And we met with Merle Haggard, and he touted the benefits of biodiesel fuel, and I wrote this main story along with this sidebar. And environmental considerations were one thing, but there were other things to take into account. Using biodiesel fuel, as I've reported in AFP several times, also, besides the environmental benefits, will put many Americans back to work in good-paying manufacturing, distribution, sales, promotion, and other types of jobs. This is good for America. Here in a nation ravaged by Mr. Rockefeller's pet free trade schemes that seek to weld our nations together into a global cage with all of us locked inside. Moreover, American family farmers who grow the soybeans, cottonseed, peanuts, corn, and other crops needed to make these alternative fuels, these people will prosper instead of being forever addicted to federal farm subsidies and things like that. Another area where propaganda reigns, but AFP tries to cover it or counter it with facts and sanity, is the Iraq quagmire and the possibility, or some would say probability, of the U.S. attacking Iran. Wait, wrong exhibit. I need this one here. Here's another prime specimen of national news magazine propaganda right here. Who could forget the faces of President Bush and Iranian President, and here I go, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad? Did I get it close? Okay. They're grimacing together here on the recent cover of Newsweek. I saw this at a Baltimore airport. The editors, it seems, carefully selected separate photos of each president, separate ones, they weren't photographed together, in an effort to portray them as being very hostile toward one another. Even though the average American knows painfully little about Iran and even less about its president. But that's just the point, isn't it, with modern big media propaganda. They know a little bit of public knowledge can be a dangerous thing. So they fill the public mind with simplistic images of two presidents allegedly hating each other, so the drums of war can be pounded again and again and again, boom, 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 by the pundits and neocon laptop commandos such as Sergeant Sean Hannity, Mr. Fight Terror Forever, and his Bush's beyond reproach brethren such as Rush Limbaugh. They love to fight, but they'll never get their hands dirty. The Hannity-Limbaugh crowd doesn't so much inform the public mind, they kind of do, but instead they confound us, don't they? They misdirect and subtly twist the public mind, which keeps people divided, confused, a little scared, and sometimes whipped into a false patriotic frenzy. Running the picture of the two menacing presidents is ringing the bell. The public responding that, yeah, Iran hasn't really done anything to us, but let's attack Iran anyway. That's the public salivating to the sound of that bell. Pavlov would be proud, wouldn't he? Behavior modification and news seem to have joined forces. To counter all this, my American Free Press colleague Michael Collins Piper actually met the Iranian president, perished the thought, and AFP published the Iranian president's open letter to the American people. It's time for another exhibit. This letter was published pure and unfiltered. It wasn't subjected to needless second-guessing at late-night editorial board meetings, nor were late calls needed to get the shadowy approval of media bosses in their obscure high-rise offices, such as Mr. Rockefeller's mysterious 5600 in New York's GE building. How many people are familiar with 5600? Aha, interesting. AFP simply ran the Iranian president's letter, here it is, to try and douse the war fire that the big media White House Wall Street alliance is busy trying to set. And he reaches out and he talks about reasons why Iran really isn't a threat to America and why peace, such a radical thought, why peace is way better than war. He was basically saying give peace a chance. Where have I heard that? Anyway, just as USA Today's seemingly broad exploration of the global warming issue really was a narrow examination of just one point of view, the issue of war is covered by the prostitute press in a manner that appears broad and open to all these divergent viewpoints, when in fact it's nothing of the sort. Instead, it's a broadside against the American psyche to make war seem like it's just about the only option. Regrettable, perhaps, but the only option nevertheless. That the Constitution only empowers Congress to declare war, and then the president constitutionally cannot put the U.S. into war all by himself, or maybe in the future herself. That's barely, if ever, even mentioned by the big media. They want us to accept unchecked executive power, whether we like it or not. Even if the Iranian president's words aren't considered credible by the big media, that isn't the point, is it? The point is to let the American people read his letter and decide for themselves, which is exactly what American Free Press is trying to do. Amen to that. Amen. Okay. A little more hydration here. I'll switch gears a bit. Let's consider a posting on the American Free Press website, which is americanfreepress.net. There's my first cheap plug for the day. Okay. Well, you can go to that posting, and there's a promotional item you can get. It's on the back table. The American Free Press table is back in that corner. They'll be glad to help you buy or look at anything you want to do. And there's a little miniature AFP back there where you can see a big headline, "The media is the enemy." Now, those are strong words. The media is the enemy. When I first saw that, I thought, well, okay, That flyer names just 6 of the billionaire media barons who decide what's news. Those 6 include our best friend, your friend and mine, Dave Rockefeller, along with those other champions of human rights with the surnames of Bronfman, Murdoch, Redstone, Rothschild, and Newhouse IV. This AFP circular states, quote, "In America today, it is a select handful of super-rich families and tightly knit financial interests, a plutocratic elite, who own the big media and who control the government through their ownership of that media. Every single one of the major media outlets is controlled by this powerful interlocking combine," end quote. They're probably in there too. Yeah, the New York Times folks, right. Moreover, this AFP article says, to consolidate their influence, the masters of the media and their international corporate allies reward obedient journalists with membership in the Council on Foreign Relations, good old Pratt House, or the Trilateral Commission, where they rub shoulders with others in the international policy-making networks. A handful of them get promoted to the higher ranks of the secret Bilderberg Group. Ah, yes, the Bilderberg Group. Here's where it gets very interesting. This is where the rubber meets the road in terms of actual cover-ups, not just misreporting, not just twisting the facts, but actually covering things up and not reporting anything. My colleague at AFP, Jim Tucker, a veteran reporter, has probably went through 50 pair of shoes over many years, tracking, visiting, and oftentimes penetrating the veil of secrecy of these secretive or semi-secretive Bilderberg meetings, which have taken place just about every year, 2 or 3 times a year since 1954. These meetings consist of brainstorming sessions by the elite from the corporate world, the big media, and from government, and a few other assorted places. Mr. Tucker of AFP wrote this superb book called The Bilderberg Diaries. How many have seen this book? I don't know that there are any at the table, but you can, I believe there are not, but you can go back there and order copies of this great book from the AFP table. I would highly recommend it. Get them while they're hot. So, one of Jim Tucker's key points in this book are that state governors and other U.S. officials are getting their travel tabs picked up by the taxpayers to take part in these secretive meetings. And these meetings are surrounded by armed guards, where high-level socializing and brainstorming sessions become, in essence, policymaking. Indeed, the Bilderberg Group operates something like your local planning commission, but on a global scale. But, as Mr. Tucker points out, beyond the fact that government officials go to these meetings at posh locations around the world on the public dime, the media component of the Bilderberg meetings is particularly disturbing. It's bad enough, I think we could all agree, that European journalists are reporting Bilderberg stories to their readers, stories that Americans generally never see. unless you go to a large library with foreign newspapers and do some digging and spend some time. What's even worse is that American media executives, such as the late Katharine Graham of the Washington Post, and other top editors and publishers, attended and continue to attend the Bilderberg meetings every year, but agree not to report a word about what goes on at these secretive policy-making meetings. These news execs have been so servile that some years ago, David Rockefeller personally thanked them for their discretion, saying the light of publicity would have made the Bilderberg World Planning Sessions toward building a world government very difficult to pull off. But before we conclude that the plutocratic elite's control of the American media is a relatively recent phenomenon, we had better take another look at this by looking at another very excellent book. I just brought the cover because the book itself is huge. Ferdinand Lundberg's America's 60 Families. Who has seen this book? That's what I thought might be the case. This is a real hidden gem. Ferdinand Lundberg, who I understand is still alive in his 90s, a great social commentator. Man, did this guy really nail the plutocrats in his day. Well before World War II, the plutocrats were gaining control over the flow of information in the United States. And Lundberg chronicled this in detail, covering the early 20th century. Referring to yesteryear's wealthy families, Lundberg wrote, "But in recent years, the Guggenheims have been content to make their major media influence felt by joining other wealthy families in the financing of propaganda campaigns to which newspaper publishers are hospitable. Congress in 1919, for example, conducted an investigation of the National Security League, which had used the press to make a broadside attack upon the nation's legislature." Lundberg added that this National Security League was financed by the Vanderbilts, DuPonts, Morgans, Rockefellers, and others. Big surprise, huh? The League's backers had drawn huge profits from the First World War and wanted to maintain these profits. That was their beef or their angle then. But even prior to the First World War, the Guggenheims and good old Daddy Warbucks, Bernard Baruch, collaborated in funding the League to Enforce Peace. Now there's an interesting name, the League to Enforce Peace. Okay. Formed back in 1915 to, and here I quote Lundberg, to carry on a systematic press campaign for drawing the United States into the First World War. The League to Enforce Peace, I still can't get past that name, had as its members those with names such as Schiff, Schwab, Warburg, Morgan, and several others. Lundberg summarized, most of the wealthy families participate in these heavily financed press campaigns, which often have as their objective the mobilizing of mass support behind policies which are contrary to the very interests of the majority of the reading public. So they were using these newspapers and these campaigns within the newspapers to attack the very readers they said they were serving. Furthermore, Mr. Lundberg got into a number of specifics in this tremendous book, including the role of, again, what he loved to call the millionaire plutocratic press. And these specifics outline how this press deliberately disinforms and does not innocently misinform the public about the pending, for example, the pending stock market crash of '29. And I quote Lundberg, talking about the stock market crash, "The farmers and the middle classes, however, have had their own interests largely betrayed by the press of the wealthy families. The middle classes, notably in their role as consumers and investors, are duped by the plutocratic press." This is way back when, you know. In 1929, for example, the press consistently refused to give due weight and display to warnings about the coming stock market crash, in which the middle classes eventually lost very heavily. Lundberg goes on to say, quote, "A factual study, Stock Market Control, published by the 20th Century Fund, shows that the press as a whole was filled with false rumors and misleading tips during the period of the boom that preceded the stock market crash." So the media was sending out false signals as the crash was coming, so people would lose more, the middle class would be more diminished, and the rich would have even more spoils to pull into their camp. Lundberg, as I'm illustrating here, documented the deceit of the plutocratic press just before, during, and after World War I, before and during the stock market crash, and forward to the 1929 through 33 Great Depression and beyond. His book came out in 1937. During the Depression, Lundberg noted that the instability of banks was generally concealed by the millionaire press. Quote, bank failures were treated as isolated phenomena. Sounds like job losses today. Your local paper will say a factory closed. Then a paper 2,000 miles away will say the local factory closed over there, but they never connect the dots that factories are closing all over due to NAFTA. There's a similarity there. So bank failures back then were treated as isolated phenomena, and suggestions by some authorities that the Postal Savings Bank would be safer than many private institutions were derided by the newspapers of that day, much to the injury of many of their readers, quote, end quote. So the papers back then were knowingly hurting the readership in the middle class, knowingly, with that technology that they had back then. So Lundberg hammers away, noting that papers such as the New York Times buried a story about one of the largest failures in U.S. history at that time, the 1932 collapse of the Insull public utility empire. And the New York Herald Tribune and the New York American both had documented evidence well in advance of the 1933 failure of S.W. Strauss and Company, a firm whose bonds had defaulted. At the time, Lundberg himself, get this, Lundberg himself was a Herald Tribune staffer covering Wall Street. So he knew firsthand that his employer, the Herald Tribune, deliberately withheld the facts from the public about the failing bond company. It's amazing. But what's really galling is that the Herald Tribune, get this, continued to publish the Strauss Company's advertisements even after the company was knowingly failing, and Strauss, the bond company, kept selling bonds of the defaulted properties. And all this was going on, these ads, when the newspaper already knew that the company was going under and withheld it from the public. Lundberg succinctly concluded back in the 1930s, no less, and this is a very important quote, listen carefully here. The class inhibitions that haunt the press under its millionaire ownership are responsible in large measure for the neurotic character of American newspapers. Because so many fields of editorial investigation and exposition are taboo, remember, they got to stay inside that box, the press, said Lundberg, must confine itself to a relatively safe, restricted area. There he's talking about the box. Lundberg added, all of this accounts for the undue press attention given to the underworld, to petty scandals involving actresses, think of Anna Nicole, baseball players, minor politicians, and the activities of the quasi-wealthy. And in order to recapture the constantly waning attention of readers, the press must rely on comic strips, inane features, contests, gossip columns, fiction, cooking recipes, chess, bridge, stamp collecting, and other similar nonsense. Quote, unquote. Does that sound familiar or what? And here's Lundberg's clincher. This is my favorite quote, maybe of all time. I'm going to read it twice, okay? American newspapers, in short, are, paradoxically and with few exceptions, not newspapers at all. I'm going to read that again. American newspapers, in short, are, paradoxically and with few exceptions, not newspapers at all. And this guy, was a far more experienced analyst than me. I'm just passing on his research. And this book was very well documented, and a lot of research went into what he was saying. In our time, even the smaller local papers aren't a whole lot better. I personally know a guy named David Frank, whose idea, an intriguing idea for a touch-tone phone-operated voting system, has made some headway in north central Indiana. But the local paper not only has stymied his idea, it also editorialized against it. And yet, this newspaper wants the taxpayers of Indiana to somehow make their voices heard, which is what Mr. Frank wants. And they want their voices to be heard at the state capitol in Indianapolis. So here we have a newspaper that wants public input but does not want Mr. Frank's system as a means of communicating that public input. Worse still, this Indiana daily paper asked the public in its editorial to lobby for higher taxes. This newspaper editorially asked the public to lobby legislators in Indianapolis for higher taxes. And they wanted the public to do this by asking elected officials to lift a property tax cap that had prevented property taxes in Indiana from going ballistic. What hypocrisy, a paper asking voters to call for higher taxes. Mr. Frank, disgusted that his voting technology idea is ignored and aware, in his view, that the local media is part of the political machine, he demanded a refund and canceled his subscription. And that's a microcosm of what we all, I believe, need to do. From all of this, we can conclude a few things. We can conclude that media manipulation of the masses by the ultra-rich has been going on for a long time, hasn't it? Especially in the U.S., though, as indicated by the AFP article on media ownership, the media is the enemy, that one, media power is concentrated in even fewer hands today than it was in Lundberg's day. But regardless of whether you're talking about the early 1900s or now, our military conflicts, I don't use the word war, they're conflicts, which have become unconstitutional, undeclared police actions with no clear purpose and no end, those police actions can be summed up as follows. Rich man's war, poor man's fight. Rich man's war, poor man's fight. Now, as was the case back in the early 20th century, we are railroaded, and I do mean railroaded, into sacrificing our youth on foreign battlefields for purposes as far removed from honorable as we can possibly imagine. The only missing piece now that was in place back in the early 20th century is the military draft. And American Free Press, rest assured, will keep an eye on that issue while trying to counter the psychological warfare that the rich-backed big media constantly wages against the American citizenry. While my speech, my oration here was originally advertised as dealing with what stories the big media spikes and why and what we can do about it, I did decide to speak on this larger issue of media manipulation of the masses. But let's assess my topic, kind of summarize as follows. 1, the media, as noted earlier, spikes not just stories, but spikes entire schools of thought from, for example, the global warming issue, leading to potentially wrong conclusions about people being solely to blame for global warming. 2, the unfiltered statements of the Iranian president never reach Americans through our media, our dominant media, which reduces his statements to sound bites, making them ripe to be taken out of context. Not to mention using pictures of him that convey aggression or instability. Here, the issue of war or peace hangs in the balance as our media manipulators, now consisting of primarily just 9 major corporations, decide who's the hero and who's the villain, and which wars are good and which wars are bad. Moreover, the big media's news formula is premised on an anti-Christian secular humanist ideology that sees human power as concentrated in governments, especially in the executive branch, as the pinnacle of human achievement, rather than being nothing more than a necessary evil that needs to be strictly limited and controlled by the people. Thanks a lot. 3, the big American media entirely and knowingly avoid covering the secretive Bilderberg Group, as we've outlined, while European papers do the opposite and tell their readers most of the time about these global planning sessions. Exposing Bilderberg widely in America could seriously slow or possibly even stop the global government architects. 4, the regular American press has been compromised by big money interests for generations, as we've learned, and it's time for the middle class, the working people, the voting, tax-paying public to fully support independent journalism instead of the establishment media. This is especially important when we recall that our ballot choices in many elections are media-screened candidates in approved political parties with acceptable ideas who've been elected for us to elect. Rigging voting machines is redundant when you can rig the public mind. And I believe Ferdinand Lundberg would agree that an inescapable question shadows over us. Why do mainstream newspapers publish at all? I'm still trying to answer that one. if they aren't there to accurately cite the Constitution and act as a real check against government abuse of power, especially the power to put us into war, then what's the point of these newspapers' existence? Everything else they print should be peripheral to a central mission of making the government obey the Constitution. Absent that central mission, there is no real mission for the dominant media. From a sane, honorable point of view, at least, we must come to grips with this fact. It's a good reason to stop subscribing to mainstream papers altogether, as Mr. Frank in Indiana did. Let's multiply his action by several million. When I went to American Free Press offices in latter January, Mike Piper showed me an old political cartoon. It was really neat. From the early 20th century, I believe it was. And it shows various national newspaper editors all walking up to the back of a big horse-drawn wagon, all of them so they could get their news dispatches from one centralized source who's handing them out the back of the wagon, the Associated Press. Even back then, it was becoming obvious that a news ministry was taking shape in America. AP, Associated Press, providing news handouts to all the dominant daily papers. But now, with American Free Press, the internet, and some other means, some other sources, this monopoly of the media ministry can be seriously challenged if we're persistent. We need not spend our hard-earned money on the big media. Even 50 cents in a news vending machine, I almost can't do it. It's time for an alternative grassroots media to shine. Let's say enough to homogenize news from the power elite. Let's say yes to a real free press and its mission to restore our constitutional system, which, as Thomas Jefferson stated, was created to put strong roadblocks in the way of anyone, no matter who they are, who seeks total power. Let's reinforce those roadblocks and derail the New World Order Express. Thanks.